Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar. I'm Jennifer Kramer, co-founder of Language Tree, and I'm just going to kick things off with a couple of housekeeping items. Anna's going to click to the next slide. 1 second here. Or I can just tell you, as most of you know, that our focus in these webinar series that we've been doing is for our secondary, our middle and high school English language learners. And today we're looking at the essential skills for each language learner level. And I also want to let you know that we are recording this webinar. And so afterwards, you're going to get a link of our recording, and please feel free to share it with any of your colleagues. Also know that we're going to be sending you some free resources to help support your secondary English language learners. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to pop those in the Q&A. And once we get to the end, we're going to open it up and our panelists are going to answer your questions, but not to worry if we run out of time and we're not able to answer all the questions, because we'll be answering those offline with our panelists, and then we'll be emailing you the Q&A so that you have that at your fingertips. So let's start off now with introducing our amazing panelists. So we have 3 panelists here, each with decades of experience. And I'm just going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves, maybe just a little bit about the multilingual learners that they've served. And I'll start with you, Sandra.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. So my name is Sandra Peñalosa, and I work for Riverside County Office of Education. I am currently the administrator that oversees instruction for our alternative education programs, which means that I serve students that are incarcerated in the juvenile court schools, or community school students, or students that are expelled or referred to our programs. And so in my role, I have a very important part in our multilingual learners, in that 25% of our student population is comprised of multilingual learners. And so my work basically revolves around professional development and training for our teachers, our principals, and our instructional assistants, in making sure that we are up to date in our strategies to serve our students.
Awesome. Thank you, Sandra. And next up, we have David.
Hello, everybody. David Noyes here. I'm an educator from the Southern California area. I've had the fortunate opportunity to work with multilingual learners for over 31 years in different capacities as a dual immersion teacher, English language development educator, teacher, and also as a curriculum support coach in the area of English language development to support teachers and students. And lastly, I guess one of my biggest passions is creating curriculum and resources for multilingual learners of all proficiency levels.
Awesome. Thank you, David. And Margaret.
Hi, I'm Margaret Towner, and I've worked many years in Southern California. I've also traveled to train teachers throughout the Southwest in language acquisition, literacy, and English learning, English learners, and English language development. So my focus has been K-12, where I had a leadership position in working with students that were in 8th grade, were below grade level in their language acquisition and their progress. And we would put them in an intensive intervention program in their 9th grade year and make tremendous growth. So I'm very excited to be here with these other 2 panelists and with Language Tree, and hope that this session is beneficial for all of you that are attending.
Great. Thank you so much, Margaret. As you can see, we have an amazing panel with all kinds of insight that they're going to share with us. So we're going to jump into the question portion. And I just want everybody to know that these questions really stem from a compilation of many questions that we hear from our district partners from teachers and administrators across the country. We often hear many of the same questions, and so we put this webinar together based on that. And I'm going to start with our first question, which is, what should you consider first when addressing the needs of your English language learners? And Sandra, if you could help us with that.
Absolutely. So first of all, we always have to put this frame of thinking in our minds. So we have to think that our students come to us with many strengths and skills. And so it is our job to figure out what those strengths and skills are. So when they arrive in our classrooms, we have to be very diligent in observing our students. And so we have to be looking out for these strengths and skills, because the students themselves are not going to tell us those things. Typically, we have to observe them. So for example, when we're looking at their oral language skills, we really have to be listening to how they communicate in the classroom. How do they respond to questions? When you ask them to do something, do they follow the correct command with the detail that you provided in the command? Or are they asking for redirection? And so that gives you a really good glimpse of whether or not they're an auditory learner, they have that comprehension or that auditory oral understanding. And so when you're listening to them in the classroom speak to each other, you're really going to hone in on their vocabulary knowledge. How do they use their words, for example, to understand what is being said to them? Do they use it? Are they able to use it contextually? Do they understand text within context? Are they able to decipher meaning from what they read? Are they able to write and express what they're thinking? And are they able to do so in a clear manner? And so we also have to understand and really keep in mind that our students come to us with cultural and linguistic assets. So many of our students are multilingual when they arrive to us. That means that they already speak 2 languages or speak another language fluently and read fluently in the other language. And they also have their cultural experiences. These cultural experiences are really going to help the teacher connect with the student and really be able to use that that background and that knowledge that student has to connect them into the learning and into the lessons. As you're observing students, you really want to see how it is that they move around socially. Are they confident? Do they have positive relationships with their peers? Are they able to work collaboratively? Are they the type of student that isn't afraid to make a mistake? Are they the type of student that's able to move through things and like, even if a mistake is made and they're given feedback, they're able to kind of push through and persist through? And their resilience and motivation, how motivated are they to really capture and understand the context of the learning, whatever it is that's being presented to them? Are they intrinsically or extrinsically motivated? And all of these things, all of these strengths, you're going to see by pure observation, right? And so you may have students that only come to you with 3 of these, but that's still a lot to build from. And so I always want to look at things from a positive strengths-based approach as we're looking on to the next step, which I will tell you what it's going to be in the next slide. So once you look at your students and you say, okay, I'm making observations in the classroom, I've noticed these strengths. Well, now it's time to really become a detective. And that is what it is. It's detective work. You're going to use sources of information to really make an educated understanding of the capacity of your students. In my experience as a teacher, I was a teacher for 12 years, and then I was a site administrator for 17. And I'm in this current role for beginning my 3rd year now. One of the things that I notice and hear our teachers say repeatedly, they'll say, you know, according to this state exam, my students at a level 3, which means they're, intermediate moving towards proficiency. But what does that mean? And I say, okay, well, this is the descriptor, but let me ask you some more questions. So then I will ask, what does their local assessment data tell you? I'll ask, What do you observe in their writing? What do you observe or listen as you're watching the students work in small groups? I'll ask them, you know, what type of work samples do you have for all core subjects that we can pull from? What are their interactions like with their peers? Have you spoken to the parent? You know, has the parent given you any insight as to what the student aspires to do, what the student is interested in, activities outside of school that the student engages with that are maybe educational as well. Maybe they're into music, maybe they're into sports, maybe they practice, you know, poetry with a group or with their church group or something like that. And so you're going to take a lot of that informal data, put it together as a detective, and then you're also going to look at your formal data to really look at, is that formal data painting the picture of the student, like the observations that you're making, is it really meshing and making sense with the formal data? Are they aligned? Okay, so then you take all of that information and that'll give you a more holistic approach to the student. So it's not just one data source giving you a number that's not really telling you a whole lot. The other important piece of this is that when you're being a detective, you're using other people's information. For example, if you're a middle school teacher serving a student, that student has multiple grade levels throughout the day, multiple subjects, sorry, throughout the day. And so you want to confer and you want to speak to the teachers, your colleagues that have that student in another class and really get a feel for what they're seeing and what they're noticing. And you can capture information that way. Same thing goes with, you know, students at a comprehensive high school level. They have oftentimes 6 teachers. And all of those teachers have anecdotal data, they have observational data that they could also share with you. And all of that together really can piece it together for you in terms of understanding where the student is really at. And the last part, I always say this to when I'm training teachers, when I'm training instructional assistants, when I'm training principals, I always say, we always want to focus on progress over time. We want to see progress happening consistently over time. Learning a language is a journey. And I tell you this because I'm 52 years old. I'm not ashamed to say my age because I'm very grateful for every day I've been given. I'm 52 years old. I am an English learner. Okay. And so my experience going through school was that in kindergarten, nobody really kind of took the time to look at my skills, what I brought from home. And so as a kindergartner that went to kindergarten already knowing how to read, I already knew how to read in Spanish. I already knew how to write in Spanish. And I was bored out of my mind. I didn't understand the language. And I very much consisted and relied on cues and verbal cues and, you know, total physical response and the teacher pointing at things. And so I got into a lot of trouble. Kindergarten was a horrible year that I wish to erase from my life. I get to first grade, the teacher asks me one question. She says, "Do you know how to read in Spanish?" And I said, "Yes, I do." Then she went through a series of gave me books and books and books to read, asked me questions, had me write, did all these things. And then she answered, basically looked into my eyes and said, "You're so smart." And that one little line changed my life forever. And so I want you to acknowledge that every student has an individual starting point. Okay. Everybody has a different starting point. We're all going to travel the line or the road of learning towards mastery, but our starting point may be different. Okay. Some students have had exposure to English in other countries because they treat English like we treat Spanish here, like a foreign language that the students are studying. So they may have concepts of English. We want to motivate our students to continue learning. And so we want to give them short, achievable goals that they are aware of. And so they are a partner in sitting down with us and saying, we say, "This is how you did on this little formative assessment that we gave you. This is how we would like you to do. This is the mastery. This is where you should be. This is what you did well. This is what we need to continue to work on. And they're a part of that conversation. And I especially say this since we're working middle school, high school, they are participants in their education. They deserve to know where they're at and where they're headed. The other thing I want us to think about is the long-term development, right? So if we're not seeing consistent growth, right, along the way, then we need to stop and ask each other, our team, ourselves, why they're not making growth and what it is that we can do to pivot so that they are able to make growth. And so instead of looking at what's missing, like I always hear conversations and I always have to shift and remind folks, say, we don't ask what's missing and we don't ask what's wrong. We ask what's next? Like what's next? What can we do next? All right. Thank you.
Sandra, that was amazing. You know what? I absolutely love your positive approach. And I think everybody here really appreciated your personal perspective. So thank you for sharing all of that. Okay, let's move on to our next question. What do you feel are the most critical skills for each proficiency level? I should say English language learner proficiency level. David, if you want to start us off.
I'd love to. Thank you. For me, I had a class full of students at multiple proficiency levels. So I really had to go to my roadmap, which are my English language development standards. And they exist across every state. And it's a rather daunting piece of resource and when you first open it up. But what I can tell you is it saved my life around organizing lessons that best met the needs for my multilingual learners. For example, when you look at each of those proficiency standards or skills and competencies, they do give you the differentiation between the levels. And when you first look at it, you kind of get a general idea of the standard. Let's say it's exchanging information and ideas, but the true detail is in the as you look below, it kind of identifies the skills that students should be practicing and learning at that proficiency level. So that really saved my life. That created my roadmap. So for example, when I was looking at exchanging information and ideas, I started looking at the details for my newcomers as well as my students that were at a beginning level of proficiency. And it's really around asking and answering questions, yes, no questions, WH questions. And so I just really dug into that standard because I realized this is a skill that students probably already know in their primary language and have practiced, but I want to make it explicit to the English language. I want them to understand what that looks like in their listening, in their collaboration, in their speaking, in their reading and their writing, just to really develop that competency. So having said that, I just think that, you know, my roadmap are these standards. And again, I wanted to point out that it is daunting at first, but once you kind of dig through the weeds and you look at the details, you really start owning those standards. And since we are the ones that are working with these students in the classrooms, we owe it to them to really understand what we're teaching.
That's great. Thanks, David. Is there anybody that wants to add on to this question?
Well, I like what Sandra and David have said, that we need to look at the positive approach, look at the strengths that students bring to us, and we need to figure out students' starting point. We need to figure out where they are, and the roadmap is our standards, and we have different standards in different states that guide us. And we need to let students know, particularly our secondary students, know where they are in their development. And if we get to really know that roadmap at particular grade levels, that can guide us forward. And I I like to use the model of a Vygotsky zone of proximal development, if you can go to the next slide, to guide me in making decisions about where is that student in relation to what my teaching is. And is it too difficult? Is it too easy? Is it just right? How do I inch them forward? How do I help them climb that mountain of language? So there's some basic things that I think that we can use in our classrooms that are easy to do and help us to access what our understanding is about our students and where we need to take them. So questioning strategies can be scaffolded. That's one of the terms that we use in relation to the zone of proximal development, is to use scaffolding up or down the ladder to put our students right at the cusp of their learning to take them a step forward. And so our questions can change according to their language acquisition levels. And David will talk more about that later. We can also vary our seating in our classroom for small group instruction with direct instruction with specific goals in mind. It might be a grammar lesson, it might be adjectives, it might be sentence structure, it might be content vocabulary, or we can vary seating so students have language models in their group close by them so that they can see different levels of language being spoken near to them and directly to them. So I like to have varied seating and opportunities for students to mix throughout the day, throughout the classroom, throughout the their time with me in middle school and high school. Also, we often can match a student that's a newcomer with a higher level student. So we can pair them with a partner so that they have somebody that can guide them with English as to getting to know their campus, getting to know the expectations of their classroom, getting to know what they need to do, what tools they need, and how they're going to perceive their education. I just want to say at this time that I have worked with many students that speak indigenous languages from South America or Central America or Mexico. And they come to school perhaps with no formal education, but they still have positive attributes and knowledge from their life. And I remember one student that talked about chickens, and we had a conversation about chickens, and he hadn't spoken up before that time. And when the conversation went to chickens, he says, there's lots of chickens where I came from. And he was from a very, very small town in basically a rancho in El Salvador. So you can have any level in your mixed level language classes or content areas. So the next slide. I want you to think about this also, the way that we give information to students. I like to follow this model by Alan Pavio. He's a doctor of cognitive psychology from Canada. And he believed that input and output should be multisensory and that we should pair the one track of language, verbal language, and attach it to symbolic language, which is visual, meaning spelling, patterns, word patterns, and to other icons, for example, realia, photographs, pictures, diagrams, linear arrays, all of the thinking maps that we know about, to have them hinge their knowledge or pair their knowledge with L1 or L2 or with imagery. So that strengthens students' understanding of the new language and allows them to accelerate their learning. So if you look at this model, you can see L1 stimuli, L2 stimuli, but also referential nonverbal stimuli. And in our brains, we go back and forth between L1 and L2, particularly when we're older and when we're adding a second language on, and our nonverbal systems are activated. And those two systems work parallel, but they also integrate if we can match or hinge information back and forth and be flexible about it. Then students have the tools to output their understanding through L1 or L2 or through gestures and showing responses. And there's many ways for us to adapt our instruction to have students do that. The next slide. So these are the cognitive dominoes that were developed by Nancy Bell for language development. And we want to have sensory input, and the sensory input can be visual, oral, it can be tactile, it can be many different ways that we receive information. And when we learn to self-monitor, is it this or is it that? That's where the teacher can step in with their questioning strategies, which we will address in a few minutes. When the student is receiving those questioning strategies and thinking, is it this or is it that? You know, is that a boot or is that a slipper or something much more complex like an idea in science? Then they can self-correct because they're at a conscious level of the learning. And then from self-correction, then students can go to independence. Self-correction carries them over into the capacity to be independent in their learning and not rely on the scaffolding that we often do during our instructional periods. And the next slide. So here are some questioning strategies for differentiation, and David will also address some of these. So I'll just very briefly go through, you know, with early learners, we can use yes or no questions or have responses on cards. We can have visual responses. They can choose which card is their response, or they can use short phrases or single words. Responding to the response is another idea from Nancy Bell. And that's where you give the student direct feedback on what they told you or showed you or wrote down. I agree with you. You find something that's positive in their response, and then you carry them to a more complete response through your questioning. So that's a good way to describe this. Can you tell me more? What would you say about what you picture? Tell me what you see in that image. Probing is very similar to that. Probing is finding out whether the students have learned what you have taught. Can you tell me more? When you say blank, what do you mean by that? So we're stretching students to see where they are and where they're ready to go. Choice and contrast questioning is that model of saying, are you saying that it's this? Can be a noun or something, a thing, or it can be an idea. Or is it that? So students have the chance to weigh both sides and say, oh, no, what I mean is it's this. So then we have our 5 WH questions, who, what, when, where, and why can be one of those questions that are simple to respond to if it's in a text, for example. If you have the evidence in the text, then a why question can be responded to. But when a why question is more complex, it's a higher order thinking question. And you're moving towards, think of Bloom's taxonomy, you're moving towards more complex thinking.
You have, sorry to cut you off. I was just going to say, you have so much amazing information. And I'm just thinking, because we're going to provide this for everybody as well. If you don't mind, just for the sake of time, maybe we'll move to the next slide.
I can just finish up one last thing.
Okay.
Socratic questioning is where you use questioning to take your students into dialogue and discussion. So Socratic questioning is really awesome when your students get to that level. And your ELs can do that. They can have those conversations. Thank you.
No, thank you. You have so much great information, and I know it's hard to keep it condensed in a short amount of time. I want to jump ahead to our third question because I think it's an important one, and maybe many people, and I've seen some of the questions in the Q&A around, what are some examples of instructional resources or tools that can help teach these essential skills? Because I know many of our educators, that's something that would be really helpful for them.
So I wanted to talk about some resources that I developed for multiple levels, just kind of hearkening back to asking and answering questions or exchanging information on ideas, that big header standard, but most specifically diving into differentiating asking and answering questions. Now, for newcomers, again, it's something that they've done most of their lives orally or in their primary language, but developing that skill in English and giving them the context that they need was kind of what that was my work. That was what was ahead of me. So one of the things that I did, and just kind of going back to what Margaret said, is providing some visual context and opportunities for collaboration. And what I did was I used vocabulary that they already knew, something that was experiential and that they were learning in middle or high school. And I front loaded that vocabulary or reviewed it, but then I attached it to the language skill. In this case, it was introducing WH questions. So I used the introduction, I modeled those WH questions and what we're listening for, what we're looking for in both listening and speaking, and I turned it into an opportunity for collaboration. So I divided the students up, I kind of modeled that opportunity, and I became the facilitator. So think of sheltered instruction activities, Kagan, SEDAI, but really moving the students into the focus of collaboration and communication around that language skill or function. It looks a little bit differently if you go on to the next slide for a student that is at kind of moving from beyond that beginning to an intermediate level. I use the same premise around the introducing the skill, but it's more of a review because I've had some exposure to WH questions. They hear it all day long in their content classes, but I wanted to really make those connections for the students. I still used a lot of collaborative opportunities, kinesthetic, word cards, questions. And again, I facilitated the students in a little bit more of a higher level opportunity to apply the skill of asking and answering questions. And then lastly, I always bring in multiple content areas. So this is kind of moving into an even higher level, our long-term English learners, but I was able to flexibly look at the standards and move into other skills such as understanding and reading how prefixes change the meaning of a word. So I wanted to allow my students to have a graphic organizer, use that, it was up in the room. My students had language logs where they were writing down these newly learned prefixes and applying those connections that they already made around. They've seen these words before, they're probably using them, but then I really contextualize it. So having said that, I brought in multiple content areas. I wanted them writing those words, just kind of exploring the meaning and the sentence and really kind of creating competency that way across the spectrum of skills that they need to learn.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. That's some great insight on all kinds of good approaches with our English learners at all the various levels. I think we're going to move into our last question, which is equally as important, but the question is, how do you know if your student has reached a level of competency with these skills? So we've talked about important skills at the different levels, but how do you know they're then competent with these skills?
So I'd like to kind of address that. For me, language competency, language is built on a continuum. I feel like my first language is English, and I'm still learning to be a fully developed, competent English speaker, reader, writer, all of those things. But for around competency for my newcomers, I used a lot speaking rubrics, because I was really focusing on the development of listening and speaking around a particular skill. So I wanted to monitor that and kind of capture that, because my students were matriculating in the next semester into a different ELD class, course, teacher. But for my students that are intermediate and long-term English learners, I really focused on the integration of all 4 domains of language equally. So I wanted my students listening to those language skills and competencies. I wanted them applying them through speaking and collaboration. I also wanted to bring those skills into reading across the content. I brought in social studies, science, math opportunities, so they were able to see where that language skill lived across the content. And then finally, writing. I wanted my students to understand that through collaboration in speaking, this is also helpful in writing. We can create that opportunity, that bridge in their writing, which so many of my students were stymied by. They just didn't get that understanding how that bridge can be made. And I had to bring that into the classroom. I had to make that explicit for my students.
And then I'll take the next part. So, okay, so I really appreciate what Margaret said about the zone of proximal development. It really is that sweet spot of learning, right? Where you're allowing students or providing opportunities for students to productively struggle. And you're really using their funds of knowledge to bring into the classroom, right? To be able to connect learning. So now let's talk a little bit about the administrator's role in supporting our EL. So if you're an administrator, on this webinar and you're thinking to yourself, okay, how do I know that the students are really getting it, right? What am I going to see in the classrooms that I walk through? What am I going to see the students doing? So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the student-centered indicators. So if you're observing classrooms and you see that students are using scaffolds on their own without being told, that's a sign that they've got it. Okay, so now as they gain independence, they don't really need to go to the scaffolds that the teacher has provided. They're able to just automatically build those into their learning. As you're observing, you're going to observe them organically participating in their groups, really being able to go back and forth with an idea, being able to deliver and express their thoughts, their opinions. They're able to justify the reason why they have a specific opinion. And so they're going to be able to ask questions about their learning, clarifying questions, or question a question, like Margaret said in a Socratic seminar, because Socratic seminars are really a question that is put out there, right? Or a topic of interest or debate or of contention, and then a question derives to another question, which is ultimately we want the students to be able to do when they go to college. When they get into those classroom discussions, that's what they're going to be doing. That's that level of questioning and answering and responding to a question. They're going to be able to ask for feedback, specific feedback about their own learning, and they're going to advocate for themselves, and they're going to know exactly what they need to do to get to the next point. And so what do I need to do to get into this AP class? What do I need to do to get into college? What do I need to do to be able to be reclassified? What do I need to do to be able to pass this writing exam? What do I need to be able to do to get a 5 on this paper that I have to write? And so, and they also don't see themselves as English learners. That title kind of goes away. They see themselves as learners. It's a mindset shift for them, right? And so when we're looking at data indicators, I think in the chat I saw a question regarding, well, what is growth, right? And so the question, that is a question that you really have to sit down with your team to really navigate and discuss, like, what is appropriate growth for your students, right? So when you're looking at each of our assessments, whether they be local or state, right, or assessments that they're taking, what is growth? What does your team in your professional learning communities view as growth? What are the SMART goals that you're setting for your students? What does that look like to your team? Because growth to me for a student may be different than how you perceive it, but are we moving along the continuum of learning? That's a big question. And so the other thing is that you have to see a match between their grades and their achievement levels in this. Everything has to kind of be in line. You can't have poor grades and then they're doing great on your assessments, or doing horribly on the assessments, but then obtaining really high grades. So there really has to be that perfect alignment. And there has to be consistent movement towards grade level in all core subjects, not just English, all core subjects. And so I could give you the next, like, as an administrator, how can you work in tandem with your teachers? But that's for another day, not today. But that's maybe some look for's for you as you're observing your classrooms. Thank you so much.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Sandra, David, and Margaret. I think what we'd like to do now, we've got a few more minutes. I see there's many questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to go ahead and just read off a couple, and if one of our panelists wants to take it, that would be great. So here's one. It says, what are the ELL levels? How can we help students become accustomed to social and cultural traditions of the school while respecting the cultural traditions they come from? How can we help newcomers who have not mastered their native language and are trying to learn a new language? There's multiple parts to this question. One last part. What is the best way to involve families in the educational process? Is there anyone that wants to kick that off?
I could take the social and the family part. So
Great.
I think if you're candid with your students and you say to them, you know, your culture, like, help me understand your culture, help me understand your traditions, help me understand how are things done, you know, in your culture. And then you can explain the culture of the United States, and even the fact that the culture in the US is really a mixture of a lot of cultures, right? And so when you begin the question with help me understand, and that's the same with the families. When you speak to your families, you can say things like, help me understand, you know, whether, like, if it's the student, help me understand more about your student. Tell me more about this. And then that's a great segue to connect them into the school while being respectful of their culture as well. So I think it hits both.
That's great. I'm going to open up another question. It's going back to the following, the standards. Does WIDA have detailed standards? All I have seen are language needed for math or science, social studies, ELA. Is there more detailed framework to follow, since the descriptors are somewhat outdated after the WIDA 2020 edition came out?
I can address that. The WIDA has a vast number of resources, so you have to really go into the proficiency level standards to understand the nuances of what skills are being taught. So they tend to front load, or they're a little top heavy around content, but as you dig through the documentation or the resource, you're going to see the differentiation around the skills that students need to know, or the competencies at each level. Again, it takes a little bit of digging, and we're not always, we don't have the luxury of, you know, having these moments of where we can take a day off and look through those standards. But I really would just strongly suggest taking the time to do that, because it does make a lot of difference around your instructional practice.
That's great. Thank you, David. I know there's many more questions in the Q&A, but I also want to be respectful of everybody's time. We have about a minute left. So again, I just want to reiterate that your questions won't be forgotten. Our panelists will answer them offline, and then we'll be emailing everybody the Q&A so that you have that information. You'll also be getting a recording of the webinar that you can share with others. And you'll also be getting the free resources to support your secondary ELLs. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining. And of course, to our amazing panel, thank you for your time, everyone. Have a great day.